Hello everyone, I'm Lena Argiri with Kathimerini and Greek Public Broadcasting. Today we'll be discussing the Eastern Mediterranean, its strategic significance and why the US must remain engaged in the region. I would like to welcome my guest, George Tsunis, former US Ambassador to Greece and a dear friend.
Thank you,
Hello,
Lena.
George. And of course, Henri Barkey, Council on Foreign Relations and Lehigh University, also a dear friend. Hello, Henri. Thank you, gentlemen, both for joining. Ambassador Tsunis, I would like to start with you. And you know, there is this discussion and this speculation about how the new US administration will approach the Eastern Mediterranean and whether it will stay engaged and focused or it will turn its attention elsewhere. So what do you think happening so far?
Lena, let me preface my answer by referring to your question. There's speculation. So I don't know if they've even begun to think about it yet. They clearly have some priorities. Those priorities are well known to everyone. What I can tell you with a fair degree of certainty is that the US-Greek relationship is very important. Having stability in the region is very important. The United States recognizes and should recognize that Greece is a pillar of stability, and they are a very reliable partner in an area that at times is in desperate need of stability. So I'm hoping that there's a continuation of past practices, that they maintain some semblance of a balance and continued engagement with Greece. I will say that President Trump is not only the 47th, but he was the 45th President of the United States. And over 4 years, and under my predecessor, Ambassador Pyatt, the US-Greek relationship strengthened and deepened, and I'm hoping that that continues with my successor, Ambassador-designee Guilfoyle as well.
Mm-hmm. Henri, I think that you don't know either, but let me give it a try. So what does Washington's long-term strategic vision for the Eastern Mediterranean looks like, and particularly when it comes to Greece and Cyprus?
Well, the long-term strategic vision of America, we know what it should be. Whether that will be under the Trump administration, we do not know. I mean, logically speaking, the United States wants a stable Eastern Mediterranean. It's a conduit to Asia. There are all these infrastructure projects that are being talked about. And to the extent that even this administration is interested in the Pacific, right? You can get to the Pacific a couple of different ways. And one way is through the Eastern Mediterranean, I mean, all the way to India, etc. So it should be in Washington's interest, but we have to find out because we don't know if this administration, as Ambassador Tsunis said, Mr. Trump was president in the 45th president, but it looks like there's a huge difference between 47 and 45.
Mm-hmm. So, George, back to you. So, what the potential dangers or risks of a possible U.S. withdrawal might be?
Look, I think there's a series of strategic withdrawals that are happening. I mean, clearly there are other priorities. President Bush had come out openly and said, we are going to focus on the Middle East, which meant that there was a withdrawal from Europe. President Obama and President Biden said, we are focusing on Asia or the Indo-Pacific. I'm not quite sure why we would signal that to anyone, but they seem to have felt the need to articulate it. It basically says to our allies, they're less important, and it says to others who are sort of strategic adversaries that the field is more open for them to play on. I think if you look at, and let me take this down to a context that the President of the United States knows very well, a sense of real estate. The strategic location of Greece, sitting at 3 choke points, Gibraltar, the Straits, the Suez Canal. It is the first country that any container ship coming through the Suez Canal from Asia hits in Europe. It could be the commercial logistics hub. It could be the energy hub. It certainly was a NATO logistics hub over these past years. It could provide an alternative to Gazprom for Europe. So, and not to mention, we operate the MDCA that we have with Greece speaks to 8 bases. I mean, it's been several more on a temporary basis as Ukraine and Gaza has caused the United States to focus on the region once more. I will tell you, without giving you a lot of detail, but I'm very comfortable in saying that how the U.S. expressed a sense of muscularity to Russia, both in Syria at the time when we needed to, and to the crisis in the north. A lot of the assets were in Greece, you know, with cooperation with the Greek government. So they were, once again, an incredibly reliable ally. And, you know, we had an incredibly high degree of cooperation with the Greek government and the Greek military. That served as a sense of stability in the region, and I think it benefited everyone. I also glad to see that although Greece and Turkey have not resolved all of their issues, I think they have, to a large part, sought to de-emphasize the ones that they can't fix, focus on a positive agenda, and over the last couple of years maintained substantially more peaceful Mediterranean.
Henri, in that evolving geopolitical landscape, and if we assume that there is no withdrawal, how do you see the U.S. managing its interest in the Eastern Mediterranean with the broader global priorities?
Look, first of all, the Eastern Mediterranean has many different aspects to it. There's a way in which, when you talk about the Eastern Mediterranean, you have to worry not about just Gaza and the conflict between Turkey and Greece and the potential for stuff to get worse. But it's also Syria, where you have a major ISIS problem. You have prisons where ISIS prisoners are being held, and if those were to one day be released, you will have the continuation in a much larger scale of the ISIS problem that we had years ago. And when you look at reports, ISIS is still, beyond those prisons, is still alive and doing very well. But strategically speaking, look, the United States has always maintained forces, and although President Trump says he's not interested in war and this and that, there is a significant component of American military wherewithal around Yemen because of the Houthis, which is also maybe a signal to Iran. And Trump does want to have a deal with Iran, it's very obvious. But so there are all these different factors, or these different balls in the air. Each one of them is important on its own right. And each one of them can have repercussions beyond itself, right? ISIS or Iran or conflict between Turkey and Greece. And that's just a few of them.
George, Henri mentioned the IMEC a while ago, and it seems that the US is interested in promoting this project as a counterbalance to China's Belt and Road Initiative. How do you see this vision playing out, and what role might Greece and Cyprus play?
Well, my answer is it depends. You know, my biggest frustration as U.S. ambassador in terms of economic diplomacy and soft power, which I consider crucial, is we had a lot of restrictions in terms of Western economic investment in areas that need it. So, you know, I had to go convince what was overwhelmingly public companies that have fiduciary duties to shareholders and capital allocation and IRR criteria. The Chinese wrote a check. So a lot of times, you know, we came with lectures on democracy and and other issues. Now, human rights are very important, don't get me wrong, and I was happy to pass that along. The Chinese were de-emphasizing things like human rights, which is a mistake in the long term and the short term, but certainly in the long term. But they came with investment. You know, the Huaweis of the world are heavily subsidized, and they have made tremendous strides in rare earth minerals and other strategic assets. And those issues have repercussions well down the road. One of the things that I had explained to Washington is no one wanted the port of Piraeus to go to Costco. But, you know, the powers of be in Brussels at the time required that Greece lease it out, and no Western company was interested in bidding it out. And it has been a huge strategic asset for China. I could replay this scenario globally. And we have a strategic adversary that makes a lot of the components and a lot of the rare earth minerals and other things like penicillin that we rely upon. That's not only an economic issue, it's a national strategic issue. So IMEC, if you're looking where manufacturing or trade is, you know, now coming in through India or Vietnam or other places, if it comes to the Middle East and it comes in through what is a huge market like the EU, the most logical place for it to enter Europe, get on rail or a truck, is in Greece. So when it comes to Greece and Cyprus being an energy hub, a logistics hub, commercial applications, transportation hub, connectivity, data centers, and all of these things that are important in the relations between nations and businesses and economic prosperity, from a geostrategic point of view, Greece and Cyprus can play, if we put this together and think about it properly, a very important role. But I will also tell you that sometimes in the West, we react to crises and we're less proactive than we should be. IMEC is a huge opportunity, and it's a huge counterbalance to the Belt and Road Initiative, where we're actually seeing some countries have left it, principally Italy. So my urging, and I'm not in government anymore, my urging is that we emphasize IMEC as a counterweight to China, but more importantly, for the opportunity that it creates, you know, between Europe, the Middle East, and the Indo-Pacific.
Henri, if the IMEC project moves forward, where Greece and Cyprus fit into the strategic framework?
Let me just start by saying that the project IMEC was very heavily pushed by Trump when Trump and Modi had a summit meeting in, I think, February, and they both said that this is their aim. They want to build the IMEC, and that they would start within 6 months, which of course is a little bit unrealistic, given how expensive IMEC is. People estimate that it's about 500 billion euros, and that's as a start. But clearly, I think if this initiative, let's say, and be optimistic, and this initiative were to start and construction would begin, then Greece will certainly play an important role. Paradoxically, Greece's competitors are the Italians and the French, right? So both the port of Marseille and the Italian port are owned by Chinese, right? So Greece, in some ways, has a big opportunity here. You can be flexible. You can use both Marseille and Piraeus, but clearly, if this were to go forward, Greece would play a very important role for the same reason that Ambassador Tsunis said. Question is, in the current circumstances that we live in, and the potential for a major global recession, I don't know where we can start. I mean, we should be realistic. I mean, this is maybe long term, but not anytime soon, as Modi and Trump suggested.
George, generally speaking, when discussing stability in the Eastern Mediterranean and maximizing the opportunities and the potential over there, we cannot ignore Turkey and its aggressive behavior. So, how do you see President Trump's relationship with Erdogan shaping or influencing U.S. foreign policy in the region the next 4 years?
I wish I knew, Lena.
You can make a guess.
I'm not in the guessing business, but clearly, President Trump has an affinity to a certain type of head of state. So I think that is the reality that everyone is going to have to deal with. In all my interactions with the government of Turkey, and there was a lot in 3 years, I will tell you, overwhelmingly, I found them to be reasonable and very, very competent diplomats. But I think they understood that Greece can be the biggest bridge to the Western world, especially Europe. They can also be a wall. I think over the years, Turkey went from a construct and an ethos of no problems with any of our neighbors to problems with every one of their neighbors. And I think that unorthodox diplomatic style did not do them any good. And I think you have seen them pivot to having better relations with their neighbors. For a time being, they improved relationships with Greece. They sought to improve them with the United States. There was an outreach to the EU, but certainly to the Saudis and the Egyptians as well. And for a time, there was an effort to improve them with Israel, and that has sort of gone the other way. I think that everyone realizes, and this is about what we're going to emphasize. Everyone realizes that it's in everyone's best interest, their nation's best interest, their children's best interest, their economic interest, their geostrategic interest, to have good neighborly relations. Turkey is not looking for a problem with EU countries. They're looking for a better customs union. They're looking for a more liberalized visa waiver program. By the way, the first visa waiver program, and just at the very, very genesis, was the agreement that was cut, and this will be the second summer where citizens of Turkey are able to come into 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 Greek islands now for a week and don't have to go through the normal process. That is part of the positive agenda. I want to see that continue. It's in Turkey's best interest. It's in Greece's best interest. And the one thing I tried to communicate both to Ankara and Athens, that no one benefits more than having healthy, peaceful relations between Ankara and Athens than the people of Turkey and Greece. It's in their best interest. So I think benefits have accrued over the last 3 years when we've seen this. Deputy Minister Papadopoulou dislikes it when I use the word rapprochement. So she thinks it's a step too far. But we have agreed that the warming of relations is accurate, and I think everyone is hopeful that it continues to build upon it.
Henri, what do you make of Trump's constant public flattery of Erdogan? I mean, it was quite mind-blowing the other day in the Oval Office when he started praising Erdogan while Netanyahu was sitting next to him.
Look, it was very surprising. I mean, there clearly is some affinity towards Erdogan, but it's also interesting. I mean, during his first term, at one point, there was this American pastor who had been jailed Brunson by the Turks. And Trump went ballistic and said, if you don't release him by X amount of time, I'm going to destroy your country. Right? And it was the same Erdogan he was dealing with. Look, I don't know Trump, but it seems to me that he has a very specific perspective on issues. What makes maybe Erdogan, shall we say, acceptable or even a favorite person, is that Erdogan had a terrible relationship with Biden. Erdogan wanted to come to Washington. Erdogan wanted to come to the White House, but Biden never invited him. On top of that, Biden had 2 summits, democracy summits, in which Erdogan was not invited. So you can imagine on the first phone call between between Trump and Erdogan, Erdogan saying, "Oh, I'm so happy you're back at the White House. Biden was the worst president the United States ever had." And that's all it will take for Trump to essentially say, "Oh, this is a great guy."
Let's schedule a meeting.
But also, interestingly, remember that, was it 10 days ago now, when the French politician Marine Le Pen was sentenced, right? She was found guilty and sentenced, not in jail. Trump was very harsh. This is not democracy, etc. He never said a word about the arrest of Imamoglu. Mind you, there are all kinds of other people, but Imamoglu as a mayor of Istanbul, and clearly trumped-up charges. So Trump is very particular. I mean, he decides on a specific person, on a specific issue, and it may contradict everything else. And he may also not know, I don't know, when you look at the record of Erdogan, polls show that in Turkey, when you ask which is the country that is the biggest threat to you, the answer with 70% is the United States. And the reason that is the case is because over the long years that Erdogan has been president, he has used the United States as the excuse for anything going wrong, right? The weather is bad, it must be the United States, right? The economy, it's certainly the United States. International politics, it's the United States. So he has had this rhetoric against the United States, which has made the United States essentially the biggest threat in people's eyes. So it's going to be interesting how Trump also negotiates that. Whether he knows about it, I don't know. But Erdogan, by contrast, and last thing I'm going to say, has never criticized the Chinese or the Russians in a way, for example, that he criticizes the United States.
Mm-hmm.
I just want to add to that. He praised Prime Minister Mitsotakis yesterday.
Mm-hmm.
I wouldn't read that much into it. And candidly, the diplomacy that I prefer would be that we don't criticize countries publicly, but we have very difficult conversations behind closed doors. Mm-hmm. I think this published beating up of nations is sort of counterproductive. Having said that, I'm in complete agreement. There is a personal relationship that's there, and clearly there's a warming of relations between Ankara and Washington. To the extent that Turkey becomes more relevant, look, they are a large country, strategically located, a large economy, and are clearly playing a more constructive role, or perceived to be the potential to play a more constructive role in Syria. We'll wait and see on that. I have my doubts as to what their intentions are over there. But they're there, and I think the president has realized we have to deal with the reality that Turkey is already in Syria, and we're unlikely to remove them. And their potential, to be helpful in settling the war between Russia and Ukraine. Look, Turkey has had an autonomous foreign policy for decades. They have, and look, he's a very smart person. He's been in office now for 2.5 decades, and he has one foot in the West when it suits him, and he has one foot in the East when it suits him. Most of the overwhelming amount of his energy comes at a huge discount from Russia. Russia provided tens of billions of euros into his banking system as he was on the verge of bankruptcy years ago. They have lent his government money. 4.5 million Russian tourists go to Turkey every year. They're building 2 nuclear power plants for them. they have the S-400 system. You know, they clearly have a deep relationship. You know, those are things that the United States is saying, well, we don't want to completely lose Turkey over to the east, and it becomes more like Pakistan. But if we think that, you know, we're going to bring them completely over and make them the 1952 Turkey that entered NATO, I mean, that's a fallacy. They are a country that is going to continue to have an autonomous foreign policy that suits their own sovereign priorities. And I think people are going to have to completely recognize that, and we're going to have continued challenges with them. But it's best if we approach Turkey with red lines, of course, but also with a sense of respect and some degree of cooperation to the extent that it works. But there also has to be consequences when they're acting contrary to Western values, democratic values, and threatening EU and Western nations.
And you mentioned the S-400s, and during your time in office...
Isn't it
no,
the professor's
your turn.
the turn now?
It's still your turn. I know that you'd like to avoid this issue, but I would like to remind you, and you know that very well, that during your time in office, the US approved the F-16 sale to Turkey, and now there is this renewed discussion about the F-35. Is the US really considering something like that?
I don't know. I'm not part of the administration anymore. I will tell you that a more cynical person than me would say that getting Sweden into NATO was a huge U.S. priority. Making sure that Greece had a qualitative military advantage, and there were certain things that were committed to Greece on excess articles, some delivered, some not to be delivered. And I don't think the ones that weren't delivered were out of malfeasance. It's just that the overwhelming priority was to put as much into Ukraine and Taiwan. But I'm hoping that every commitment my government made to Greece is fulfilled. But Greece also got the F-35s. I'm not going to get into what the war game scenario is between F-35s and F-16s, but it's pretty significant. So that was the work that I had part of. There was, at least I didn't engage in anything that considered F-35s to Turkey because, you know, Katska was very, very clear, and as long as you have the S-400 system and you're under Katska sanctions, that was completely off the table. Now, what I have heard in the prior government, my government was if, very important, if Turkey was not in possession of the S-400, which means it had to be taken out of their hands and destroyed. And that was an offer that was made, I think, in 2018 when President Erdogan was in the Oval Office with President Trump and 6 senators. And President Erdogan turned it down. So if he destroys a $2.5 billion system, then that opens up the opportunity to remove him from Katska. And then there is a process of a foreign military sale that goes through, you know, the 4 corners and whatnot. But it has always been, and I hope that it continues to always be predicated on the fact that to be removed from Katska, you have to not be in possession of the S-400. Now, for me, and as a former lawyer, that's very, very clear. That's not, you know, moving it across the street or something like that. That's destroying it. That's destroying the system, so it's not usable. And I think, you know, if the United States values itself on being a savvy negotiator and cutting a good deal, then, you know, if Turkey is looking to get back into a weapons program of a more sophisticated military equipment, then it should comply with U.S. law, full stop.
Henri, if Trump were to lift Katsa sanctions and proceed with the F-35 sale to Turkey, why would that be a significant mistake? Maybe a mistake that the U.S. And its allies in the region, including Greece, might have to deal with for decades to come.
What's the last part?
That if the U.S. decides to sell the F-35s to Turkey, that would create a problem for its allies in the region.
Yes, I think it's not going to be that easy to sell the F-35s, even if Trump were to decide from one day to another to waive the sanctions. I don't know, Ambassador Tsunis would know better. If he has even that authority, he has to go through Congress. But look, the F-35s and the S-400s in the same location is a real problem. Why? Because the S-400s, as we all know, are a threat to the F-35s. But the issue is, I don't think the Turks can take the F-35s and give it to, I don't know, to Venezuela or to some other country, even as a gift. Because if you remember what happened with the S-300s, the S-300s were bought by Cyprus. There was enormous amount of pressure put on Cyprus. And what happened to the S-300s? The S-300s were moved to Crete. Right? And then every single NATO Air Force and the Israelis and other allies trained against the S-300s, which meant that they knew how to deal with the S-300s when they had to confront them. That meant that the Russians this time are probably smart enough to put a clause there and say, you cannot transfer them. So the options are, you can't leave them in a box because you don't know when that box can be opened. So you will have to destroy them. And that, I'm not sure, is something that Erdogan would like to do. So it's going to be very difficult to navigate this S-400 business. And the F-35s, remember, it's not, you're not buying olive oil at the supermarket, right? So I understand the Greek F-35s will not start coming in until 2028. The Turks have to get in line because there are other countries which have also ordered. So let's say, in the best of circumstances, 2030. Between now and 2030, lots of things can change. Another government can come in the United States, can annul the sale. So I'm not convinced that the Turks will get their F-35s anytime soon. And it's also a lesson for Erdogan, not that he actually necessarily integrates them. The F-35s cost the Turks a lot, not just the money that they lost with the F-35s and the money they gave for the S-400s, but you have to remember that the F-35s were going to be partially manufactured in Turkey. The Turks were going to get both jobs, technology transfer, and foreign exchange. That's what they also lost, which I think in some ways is very important. But here is something maybe we can discuss later, but I would like to stress one thing here. We talk about Turkish national interest, and Ambassador Tsunis said, Turkey is a serious country, it's a big country, it has interests. But I am of the conviction that there is actually a difference between Erdogan and Turkish national interests. They are not the same. He has his own ambitions, and they don't necessarily coincide with Turkey's long-term interests. And that we can discuss later if you want. But the point I'm trying to make here is that no matter what happens at the White House, if Erdogan will go there, he was supposed to, by the way, and it got postponed because of the Imamoglu protests. And now they're talking about Trump stopping on his way back from Saudi Arabia. It's going to be far more complicated. It's not something you can just turn the page on.
Okay, you have to wrap it up, gentlemen, unless you want to add something.
To the professor's point, when they got removed from the F-35 program, it was a $12 billion hit to Turkish manufacturing. But I do want to point out one other thing. Turkey had given a $2.5 billion deposit for the F-35s. We have no mechanism to return that money. There are 6 F-35s that belong to Turkey that are sitting in a warehouse that can go the day after sanctions, the F-35 is approved. So they could get them immediately and jump the line. As for the rest of them, they got to get into the queue, and that queue is probably 6 years from the date of signing, which is a long way. The president does have the authorization, if his legal team determines that they are not in possession of the S-400, that's a presidential finding, and my understanding is his lawyers are working on that.
Of course.
That can be done unilaterally by the president. Congress can go back and override that, but that's also a difficult hurdle. When he presents, it goes to the four corners. If the four corners hold that up, and I would imagine at least one of them would, then he has to contemplate breaking the holds. The only time, to my understanding, that the holds were broken in recent memory was by President Trump with an issue with Saudi Arabia.
2019.
Khashoggi. So I don't know that President Trump would be wary about breaking the holds. So I do have a level of concern because as much as I want Turkey to be less challenging of an ally and more of a stability provider, some of their actions and some of their rhetoric is something that should give all of us some pause. So I'm hoping to encourage Turkey to be a more reliable ally to the West, because I also think it's in its long-term best interest.
George, Henri, thank you very much for this discussion. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you also for being here with us today.